Hello, and welcome to Cathy Reads. Today is Pulp Fiction Friday, and I'm reaching for my camera to kind of lower it a little bit, like that. Not that you can tell. Hey, Fangwad. Fangwad, it's reading day. It's reading day. How are you? I finished painting this model. That's the one I was working on, and of course, it looks terrible. Because autofocus it's a terrible thing unless you're just doing this. Anyways, the model I was working on yesterday is done. I will post pictures. I painted base rims, so technically 2 of those models are finished. No, you know what? Not finished. I just remembered there's you'll laugh. There's this little thing on the back of the base right there that I totally forgot to paint. There's a detail back there. Completely forgot about it. Also, I need to do the matte varnish. So, I have not got my mail yet. Well, no, that's wrong. I did get mail today, but I did not get a picture. As far as I know, there's no picture in our tiny mailbox. It happens sometimes. Well, you know how the mail is right now. Everything is crazy. Uh, everything's crazy. So I wouldn't worry about it too much if it's just a day. I know, I'm looking forward to it. And well, we so back when we were doing 2D art, we cut a lot of mats. A lot of mats for art. We have a mat cutter in the basement. So the Shork is going to get a nice mat. And a mat means it's officially done. Just like painting the base rim on your model means it's officially done, except for when you're Cathy and you completely forget to paint a specific detail on the base, like I did on that model. Because that's always how it is. You think you're done. You think you're done. You finally, like today, I just spent time focused on painting this one, well, not one, but the staff on that model that she's holding, and the birds that we determined were swallows of some type. So I painted them like purple martins, and I just put the finishing touches on that staff, and I put highlights on the roses on the base and hanging off of her belt. And so that's done. And then I painted the base rim, and once I finished painting the black on there, as I turned it around to paint that side, and I was like, oh, there are these designs on the base, and I did not paint them because yeah. Kind of like when I thought I was finished with the Genasi, which originally was an air Genasi, so I did the stuff she's standing on to be like clouds, and then it was, do you think you could make this into water instead and have her be a water Genasi? And I was like, well, that's easy. So I thought I was done, but I wasn't done. I had to go back and do a little bit more to it, but it's not a big deal. Fengwad says I'm doing well. I'm working on my magical girl at the moment, trying to figure out how to balance the warmth. There are way too many warm colors on there right now. Why are you using all those warm colors, Fangwad? How many colors are you using on this model? Are you using more than 6? Not counting white. My my phone is just making sounds and I forgot to mute it. I apologize. Apologize. Let me just fix that. Fixed. Oh, hey. I guess the real brush guy must be here. Thank you for hosting my stream, Real Brush Guy. V says her dad has a mat cutter as well, and that will eventually be mine, she says. All the things. I swear you just said Guten Tag, Fräuleins. That's how I hear that in my head. You're awful. Fangwon says, I wanted the model to be primarily red, so she has a red dress, boots, gloves, and hat. Then she has a warm, dark brown skin and bright, yellowy orange hair. So you could have a warm, dark brown skin where the midtones are all warm and still use cooler colors in the shadows and the highlights. Or use cool colors in the shadows and use warmer tones in the midtones and the highlights. Or use warm midtones, warm shadows, and do cooler highlights for a bit of contrast. And you pretty much can do that with all the things. Like I like to do that if I have something that's warm in the midtones, like the base color. Like this shirt is sort of a warm burgundy color, but then like some of the highlights I would maybe do a cooler color. And in this case it looks like, as I'm looking at the shadows on this shirt, the shadows are also warm. So doing a little bit of cooler highlight would be a good way to make a bit of contrast, make it a bit interesting. We don't use the word Fräulein anymore unless you're the real brush guy and you're coming into this chat so that you can be corny. and say Guten Tag, Fräulein. Fräulein. Frau. Frau. I'll just stop right there with that. Fangwon says I can put a little bit of blue in the shadows, but it won't be enough. Well, then put a lot of blue in the shadows. Then it will be enough, right? So at the midtone of Reaper Clear Red, how would you do a cooler highlight? I would maybe... I was just gonna hold... You know what? I'll just switch the camera. Hold on. I always like this color for... Oh, I restarted my computer, so hold on. Earlier... So I need to fix my camera setting. So this color, I mean, this is Vallejo Game Color Verdigris, but it's really just a minty light green, which you could probably get by taking some phthalo green and some white, which would make a cooler color. I haven't used that for a while, but you know, or a bluish white with a little bit of the red mixed in, or a cool purpley color. Penguin says, and you might be interested to know that it actually is brushy. Ich liebe dich auch. V, always go with your first instinct, right? Penguin says, so highlight the red with the green white instead of the yellow white if you want it to be cooler. Yes. But also you mix a little bit of your red in with it too. So the book today, now there's a few things I thought would be fun, and I'm gonna switch my camera back. There's a few things I thought would be fun. I still have some Sherlock Holmes. For really cheesy, horrible writing, I have the Pulp Fiction Mega Pack, and on the cover it says, "Not politically correct. You have been warned." And then it says, "Apes, sex fiends, gangsters, mad scientists, tentacles." So there's that. Like, I'm sure it's terrible. Like, I'm sure it's terrible writing, terrible stories, terrible topics, terrible words being used. In the Pulp Fiction Mega Pack. Sex fiends, V. Tentacles. Big Jim Slay Gaming. Hi. So one of the options that I have here today is the Pulp Fiction Mega Pack. It's got a whole bunch of. It has 25 classic pulp stories, and right on the cover of it, it says, in case anybody missed it, it says, "Not politically correct. You have been warned." Fangwad says, "I vote for the gods of Mars." Rush Guy says, "Alien sex fiends?" It seems that way. I also have a book called Voodoo Planet by Andre Norton. And I love Andre Norton. So that's a possibility too. You read whatever you want to read, says V. Yes, but then I have to make up my mind. So I think Voodoo Planet would be a longer story, so I might do something shorter first and then go into that. V says, "I'm just here coloring bookmarks I made from the tail ends of postcards I cut out." That seems like a good idea. Apes, sex fiends, gangsters, mad scientists, tentacles. Hold on, what do we have here? We have a story called When Manhattan Sank by George S. Brooks. Don't know when this was originally written. Let's just read the first couple paragraphs. We'll see how we feel about it, okay? We'll just read the first couple paragraphs. Fangwad says, "Is the gods of Mars even a choice?" I mean, if I want to search through my library, which is not going to take very long, it could be a choice. Maybe. But I kind of want to just do something else right now. And then we'll return to the Mars series. Of course we'll return to the Mars series. Is the Gods of Mars the second book, Fangwad? Okay, so the first couple paragraphs. You want all Edgar Rice Burroughs all the time? I have Tarzan sitting here too. Tarzan. The original Tarzan. Which I love. Mm. And it gives me so many excuses to make monkey sounds. Which is really all anybody wants, right? Monkey sounds? If you read Tarzan, will you sing epic Phil Collins songs? I will not sing epic Phil Collins songs. JJ says, talk supple to me, Cathy. How's that? Supple enough? Okay. We're just reading the first couple paragraphs of When Manhattan Sank by George S. Brooks, because I just want to see how it reads, okay? Those who survived the destruction of Manhattan will never forget the morning of September 16th. I have an almost equally vivid remembrance of the evening before. Many persons have since claimed that they sensed impending disaster for varying lengths of time prior to the first shock. Women, alleged to possess psychic power, have said that there seemed to be a great weight hanging above their heads, or that for days they felt they were walking on the edge of a great abyss. Supernatural warnings, too, were conveyed to persons who failed to heed these omens. Figures of deceased relatives, they maintain, appeared to them in their dreams and in waking visions. Others assert that when they went to bed on the night of the 15th, they found difficulty in breathing. A former night watchman at the Postum building told me, and he evidently believed it, that about midnight he observed a blazing meteor or comet, dagger-shaped and flame-colored, streaking across the sky. You're asking if it's women who possess psychic power or women who possess psychic power. So, let's go back. It says, women alleged to possess psychic power have said that there seemed to be a great weight hanging above their heads. So, like, just women in general? Just all women? Yeah, that's exactly how I was reading it, Fangwad. And that's what it said. Pulp, pulp, pulp. Yes, Rathmore. Yes. V says, I am psychic like Sherlock Holmes. Oh, so psychic in that you're observant of the world around you and draw conclusions on what you learn. Okay. We'll just continue with Manhattan Sank because it seems like cheesy pulp fiction is the winner here. Well, we'll find out if it's the winner. This could just be really awful. It's not like I vet these things beforehand. I mean, I've read Tarzan a bunch of times, but that's totally different. Someday I'll read Tarzan, but for now we're just reading this and hoping it's not terrible. All right, so the dagger-shaped comet, flame-colored, streaking across the sky. This is where we ended up. It is true that almost everybody had thought about an earthquake because of the statement of the eminent British geologist, Sir Maurice Lockwood. About the first of the month he had announced that there appeared to be a fault in the rock strata under Manhattan, and added that this might slip, causing an earthquake like that which destroyed the Japanese cities. His theory, however, was not new. Other scientists have held it. It was given wide publicity chiefly because of the energetic labors of a lecture bureau press agent. I believe any unbiased observer will agree with me that all the elaborate warnings are a mere post facto invention, although the stories may be credited by the persons who tell them. So, conspiracy theories. That's what this guy is saying. It's all conspiracy theories. Hey, Trouble. Excuse me. Sorry. Any unbiased observer will agree with me that all the elaborate warnings are mere post facto invention, although the stories may be credited by the persons who tell them. Never did downtown New York seem more prosperous, more stimulating, more alive than on the late afternoon and evening of September 15th. It was a perfect late summer day, almost too warm for comfort. The evening was luxuriously cool. Since my brother was ending his annual week's visit to the city that night, he refused to go to a theater, saying that he preferred to talk. We ate a leisurely dinner, washed down with white wine and Swedish punch, at a little Scandinavian restaurant on Upper Broadway. Matt had made sleeper reservations on a train that left the Grand Central at 11:30 o'clock. So when we lighted our after-dinner cigars, we had more than 2 hours to waste. We walked across the city to the Kelton Hotel where I lived at Lexington Avenue near 48th Street. Have a good lunch? I asked. Bob Whiston had taken Matt to lunch that day at the Bankers Club. Oh, pardon me, they call it luncheon. Luncheon. It's not just lunch. It's luncheon. Yes, Rathmore, 11:30 o'clock. You've walked near Lex and 48th? I feel like I have, too. It sounds very familiar. Ooh la la. Yes, very fancy. It is both fancy and schmancy. They had luncheon that day at the Bankers Club. Oh, yes, Whiston seemed like a good fellow. None better, I agreed. And how about Miss Hull? We had had dinner at Mary Hull's apartment the night before. She's smart. Matt is not given to wordy praise. She's good looking, too, and she certainly wears clothes. Misco, I did miss your hydrate. I am sorry. That is a fantastic expression. She certainly wears clothes. Right, V? V's like, though I'd rather see the ones who don't wear clothes. Thing one says, that is what we call suspicious specific compliment. Yeah, sounds like a 6-year-old lying. Totally was wearing clothes. She was, I swear. Anyways, as Matt packed his bags, we split a pint of scotch. Then Matt suggested that we go up on the hotel roof. 'Cause that's what people do in New York. Well, I mean, maybe back in the day when people went up on hotel roofs. Now all I can think is the coasters, or the drifters, I mean, up on the roof. Which is a good song. A pint, yes, Brush. They come in pints. Pint of whiskey. Big Jim Slade says, it absolutely is. One of my favorite spots is a rooftop bar at a hotel on 35th. That's cool. All right. Then Matt suggested we go up on the hotel roof. In the sun parlor, we found the lights turned discreetly low. Several couples were surreptitiously necking in the least conspicuous corners, as they do in all big hotel lounging rooms. I mean, shocking! Hold on. Scandalous. Yeah, they were probably wearing clothes. But it doesn't specify if their ankles were bare. And I don't know when this was written. So, Oh, I heard Matt sniff contemptuously. This is a hell of a place to live, he growled as he walked out on the deserted roof. The damned apartments are so small that people have to go to hotels and theaters to make love. No privacy anywhere. It's just your upstate farmer inhibitions that make you think it's indecent. Right? Yeah, Matt's totally jelly. He's totes jelly. His upstate farmer inhibitions. It's all fine. I didn't say I thought it indecent, Matt retorted. I said it was rotten taste. I laughed at him. He always had those fits about New York. He would be enjoying himself hugely when he would suddenly remember that he did not approve of the things he was seeing and doing. Whereupon he would burst out with one of his rumbling tirades. Matt is big, blond, broad-shouldered, and afraid of nothing except city traffic and rattlesnakes. I think he prefers snakes to taxis, however. JJ suggests sung to the tune of Uptown Girl, Upstate Farmer. It's only rotten taste if they eat some nasty food first. Exactly, Rathmore. Bangwad says, now I need to know what he means by upstate. Does he use it like normal people to mean just upstate, or like a New York City resident who means anywhere except New York City? Yeah, it's like a one syllable too long, JJ. Well, let's find out. Take that pigeonhole apartment of Miss Hull's, for instance, Matt grumbled with fine scorn, although he knew as well as I did that Mary Hull paid as much rent for those 3 or 4 rooms as Matt makes in net income from a large fruit and stock farm. Where would you hold hands there? There's no place, if her mother was home. I looked in the kitchenette, but you couldn't get 2 persons inside it, even if they were parked close. Any romance in this town has to be as synthetic as the gin, I guess. I laughed, handing Matt one of his favorite cigars. I remembered his comment when we got caught in a midnight subway jam. Who pours the olive oil over us? He demanded as we stood sardine-wise in the choked aisle. Matt struck a match on the seat of his trousers, a habit which he refuses to discontinue, although it ruins his best clothes. It's the one masculine gesture left in smoking, is his explanation. He puffed out an immense cloud of smoke and pointed down the street to the great bulk of another hotel, where hundreds of lighted windows gleamed through the night. See, Matt indicated them. Mother is waiting up for her boys. Without preface or apology, he turned to me. Going to marry Miss Hull? He demanded bluntly. I'm afraid not, I returned, wondering how he had guessed that I wished to. Why not? If you're satisfied, go ahead. Thank you for your permission. That's all I've been waiting for. Matt allowed a mouthful of smoke to drift away from his lips in half-formed rings. Maybe you think that banker fellow's competition is too strong, he continued, in a Dorothy Dix tone, giving advice to the meek. Don't mind him. I watched them together, and she doesn't care for him. He's Robert Breakwyston, with plenty of money, family, and brains, I retorted hotly. Besides, he's a darn good fella in the bargain. He's 1,000% a better match for any girl than I am. Remember, you're Alexander McNair Tenney, without family, money, or brains, said Matt with fraternal candor. That's why she's apt to pick you. Women love to make martyrs of themselves. Shut up. Besides, I don't think Mary Hull cares to marry anyone. Don't you believe it. I've heard a lot about the new women down here, but they don't come as new as that. Yonkers, I barely know. That's reaching. That's reaching, JJ, but I appreciate it. Yes, V, new women. You know, they get silly notions in their heads, like independence. Like, you know, not needing a man or some nonsense like that. Why should she? I grew quite warm in defending Mary's right to remain unmarried. She's made a name and a place for herself in the import trade. She's really important, a celebrity. Matt threw back his head and laughed. New York Broadcasting again, he mimicked my tone perfectly. Station BUNK. That's all I hear in this place. With one sweep of his arm, he included the reflection of the Broadway electric lights, the rows of Park Avenue apartment houses, the towering office buildings in the lower 40s, the East River with its miles of docks, and a lighted biscuit factory in Long Island City. You're all important, awfully important, Matt fumed. I've yet to meet a New Yorker who wasn't. You all admit it. Why, New York papers claim that the metropolitan murders are more murderous and the metropolitan divorces are more scandalous than our poor little affairs in the interior. But Matt, you and Mary Hull, for instance, you both think you're important. So you are, to yourselves. It's just the same with all the rest of these people. Come, Matt, listen to me. You must admit that everything in the commercial, financial, and the artistic world is centered here. Matt paid no attention to the interruption, but continued his recital. The other American cities are married to the United States, while New York is the country's kept woman. She has no legal claim for support, but as kept women always do, she gets more attention than Uncle Sam gives his wives. Sure, New York's important. So is the correspondent in a divorce suit. So were the King of France's girlfriends. Matt chuckled, looked at his watch, and turned to the door. Train time? I asked. Nearly. Then Matt grinned at his figure of speech. I admit, he said, that I like to romp with your wanton city. She gives me a great vacation between pear and apple picking time. But you should tell Lady Manhattan not to take herself so seriously. If she continues, I'll put a personal in the Times and warn her that her true character is known. Wanton City. Wonton City. That's a restaurant, right? Wonton City. Oh, now I want to eat there. That would be the perfect place. Fang what? Silly notions like reading Pulp Fiction on stream. Yeah, it's just stupid. Fangwad says, wait, what does any of this have to do with Manhattan getting destroyed? Well, Fangwad, I'm glad you asked, because I don't know either, and I was wondering the same thing. 1 ton of wonton. A wonton ton of wontons. Let's find out. Cream cheese wontons. Oh, yeah. I too would like a ton of wonton. I'd like wonton soup. Luke says I ride one tauntaun. We walked to the Grand Central Station. Just before Matt handed his ticket and Pullman reservation to the gate man, he turned and shook hands. Had a fine time, Alex, he smiled. I like you as a brother, if you are a New Yorker. In fact, you qualify better than some of our worthy Rotarians upstate. As for Miss Hull, don't worry. She's reached the point where she'd rather listen to you than talk herself. That's the test of true love, especially with a New York woman. It doesn't last long after marriage. Enjoy it while you may. I'm coming to your wedding, if I'm asked. He started away, then paused and grinned sardonically. Some day I'll make you tell me how and where you found a place to propose to a girl. I'll bet you have to do it on top of a Fifth Avenue bus. He waved his hand and passed the gate. After Matt disappeared, I found myself wondering irresolutely about the station. An illogical but overwhelming desire to see Mary and to speak to her had grown out of his raillery. However, a few minutes before midnight is scarcely a conventional time for calling upon a woman to ask her to marry you. I happened to remember that Bob Whiston had said he was going to Mary's apartment that evening to play a few games of double solitaire with Mary's semi-invalid mother. I'm just going to swing around, play a few games of double solitaire. JJ is completely right. A few minutes before midnight is the best time to call upon a woman. They're sleepy and say funny shit. That is true. That's very true. Double Canfield and Napoleon are Mrs. Hull's only dissipation. I stepped into the nearest phone booth and called Whiston at the Engineers Club. Has Mr. Whiston come in yet? I asked. On his way upstairs now, sir. If you'll wait a minute, I'll ring his room. Never mind. I broke the connection and called Mary's apartment. Evidently, Whiston had left there only a few minutes before. Yes? Came her voice, low-pitched and intriguing as she is herself. Mary, this is Alex. May I see you for a few minutes? I just put my brother on the train, and I'd like to see you, well, because I'd like to see you, I concluded lamely. Fangwad says, pretty sure you don't want to stop by Girl You Like's place while she's playing double solitaire with another guy. Well, see, he made sure the other guy was no longer there, so it all works out. She whispered her reply into the mouthpiece. I'm sorry I can't ask you to come over. Mother's going to bed and it would disturb her. Why do you want to see me? Matt's comment that there was no fit place in New York in which to propose to a girl flushed into my mind. For a moment, I could think of no spot, private or even semi-private, where I might take her. How Matt would have laughed if he could have read my mind as I stood in that telephone booth. Excuse me. Well, Mary, you see, I stammered like a schoolboy. Alex! Mary's voice became firm and decisive. Have you been drinking too much? No! I roared, the injustice of the accusation stinging. I've not been drinking enough. I forgot all my prepared finesse. I wanted to ask you if you'd consider marrying me. Mary Hull did not exactly gasp at the announcement. The sound was more like an excited giggle. I presume my indignation, when she assumed I was too familiar with a bottle, crept into my voice, and that I roared at her as I do at the office boy when he forgets to mail a letter. Mary said nothing for a minute. The telephone operator interrupted. Your time is up, please. Don't cut us off, I shouted. I'll drop another nickel. I fumbled in my change pocket and failed to find the coin. I finally dropped a quarter. A whole quarter. Right, JJ? A private spot where I might take her. What kind of smut is that? It's filthy. Yeah, only a half a pint of scotch, right? Clearly not enough. Not drink enough. That's what he said. So he, instead of a nickel, he spends an entire quarter. You made a mistake in the coin, please, piped the operator. Hell's bells, I growled. Get off that wire. I could hear Mary laughing. By the time I was thoroughly angry, I swore at the telephone, the operator, at Matt, at the city, at my own stupidity. Had Matt, whose train must have been up on 125th Street, heard me, he would have laughed for a week. At length Mary halted my tirade. Alex, dear, said she, do you still want to marry me, or are you changing your mind? Well, do you think I paid 30 cents for this call for fun? I retorted. I put a quarter in this thing, expecting to get my money's worth. In that case, it's only fair to tell you that I would like to marry you. I did not know what to say next. I had a vague idea that one kissed one's betrothed as soon as possible after such an avowal, but obviously that was impossible over the phone. Not in this day and age. Aren't you going to do something about it? It was the only thing I could think of to say. Mary laughed harder than ever. Want me to confirm it in writing? She suggested, adding in her dictation tone, this will confirm our telephone conversation of last night. I meant go somewhere. I'm serious about this thing. I can't slip out tonight, dear. It would disturb Mother. Call me in the morning. Yes, about 8. And Alex, I do love you. Good night. Her receiver clicked as she replaced it upon the hook. I left the Grand Central and walked north on Madison Avenue. I was not precisely elated. At least, I was not conscious of any feeling of elation. Instead, I was worrying over the most trivial details of our engagement and marriage. I remember that I was greatly concerned lest Mary should keep her professional name after we married, instead of calling herself Mrs. Tenney. It was the only time in my life I was ever disturbed by the activities of the Lucy Stone League. I also worried about buying an engagement ring. I wondered if it were quite all right to take Mary to the jewelry store and let her pick it out. If I did that, how could I prevent her knowing how much it cost? These and other ridiculous details occupied my mind while I was walking clear to 90th Street. There I stopped, realized my own folly, and looked at my watch. It was 1:25. I retraced my steps to 86th Street and Lexington Avenue, and entered the subway station. I caught the first downtown local train, intending to get off at 51st Street. As it happened, the train was crowded. I walked forward and stood at the front door in the first car. At my right was the motorman's box-like control room. To that circumstance I owe my life. As the train shot through the tube, I negligently watched the red and green signal lights that flashed past as we roared along, or stopped with a rattle of doors and a grinding of air brakes at the stations. We stopped at the 59th Street station. More passengers entered the car. Rather a jolly crowd of men and girls filled the aisle behind me. The train moved on, gathering speed as it went. Then the first shock hit us. That was, of course, the tremor at 6 minutes past 2 o'clock that was recorded upon the seismographs. It shows how little credence one may give to one's own judgment of time, for I would have sworn it happened a full quarter of an hour earlier. We were moving at a speed of perhaps 20 or 25 miles an hour. Suddenly the car lurched. I was thrown against the door of the motorman's control room, and at the same instant the lights went out. Our train left the tracks, and with a tremendous crash of glass, the right side hit the wall of the glass tube. The motorman fell out of the door and sprawled over me. Some of the passengers screamed shrilly. I had never before experienced a quake, and my first thought was, there must be a terrific explosion. For a minute I lay upon the car floor, numbed in mind, while my palsied limbs shook with the terror that follows surprise. The sensation was exactly like that which I encountered more than once during the war, when an enemy bombing plane was overhead, and when one could hear the swish of a high explosive projectile before it hit the earth. But the very blackness of the tube was as terrifying as the train's derailment, with its accompaniment of wails from the injured. I knew now how a miner must feel at the moment when there is a disaster in the working. JJ says, sprawled over me. Reminds me of a girl Dio used to date. The motorman and much of the wreckage of the door had fallen upon me. He stirred and muttered, God. It was not profanity, but a prayer, as he said it. He was pulling himself to his feet when a second shaking of the earth threw him down again, his shoulder digging into my ribs. That was the jar at 9 minutes past 2 o'clock. What's exploded? I gasped. That ain't no explosion, he returned. That's a quake. I was in one once before. Above our heads sounded a dull thud as the fronts of some buildings rocked and collapsed upon the pavement. Goodbye, New York. The motorman found his feet and helped me up. Come along with me, he ordered, and we got to get these people out of here somehow. How? Behind us, in the wrecked cars, was Bedlam. He slid the front door open, unhooked the guard chains, and dropped down to the roadbed. Come along, he ordered. We'll go to the next station and get us some oil lanterns. We can't do nothing without a light. I hesitated about stepping down into the black pit. You needn't be afraid of the third rail, he assured me. The juice is off. So I stumbled along behind him, more than once tripping on steel supports and columns that had been shaken from their places. We left the madhouse of the wrecked train behind and found ourselves in a silence as oppressive as the tomb. Once he fell upon a girder and I stumbled over him. As we regained our feet, I noticed a hissing sound. What's that? I asked. In another moment I knew. I could smell the sweetish, sickish odor of illuminating gas. The motorman sniffed the air. Broken gas main, he said shortly. We got to hustle if those poor devils have a chance back there. He broke into a shuffling run. Hurry, he urged. We stumbled on. I was trying to breathe as little and hurry as fast as possible. Ahead of us something roared like an approaching express train. I realized it was not, just as I instinctively thought to flatten myself against the wall to let it pass. It was the sound of water. It was a deluge of water pouring into the tunnel like a huge cascade. His feet hit the water first. I heard him splashing. There's a dip at the station, he called a final warning. You'll have to swim for it. In another second I was waist deep in the flood. It hit me like a wave. A second wave lifted me from my feet, and I stretched out my arms to swim with a purely instinctive motion of self-preservation. A third wave engulfed me. I felt myself drawn back into the deadly cave from which I was escaping. I swallowed a mouthful of salt water, strangled, gasped, sank. Then my knee hit a rock. Half walking, half swimming, I felt a concrete step, and above it a picket fence. The subterranean deluge had tossed me like driftwood upon the platform of the 51st Street subway station. I never knew what became of the motorman who saved my life by leading me from the wrecked train. Perhaps, with his better sense of direction, he may have reached the platform and escaped. It is more likely that the wave which lifted me up to safety carried him back into the tube. I clung to the iron pickets, moving along them until I reached an open exit gate. I waded past the deserted ticket seller's booth to the steps and crawled on my hands and knees up to the street level. My teeth were chattering from the chill in the air. From the moment of the first shock when our train left the tracks, I had been in the most oppressive darkness I had ever known. It was like the interior of the closest room on the darkest night. It was a kind of blackness that weighs one down beneath it. Compared to the tube, Lexington Avenue was light, although there was no moon, no street lights, and no lighted houses. Only the myriad of clear, peaceful stars gleamed overhead. About me, Lexington Avenue was deserted. Looking northward toward Harlem, I could see an indistinct mob of fugitives crossing the street. They seemed to be moving toward Park Avenue. Swedish gas. Swedish. It's Swedish gas, That's what powers all the, it's a natural gas. JJ says, deadly cave from which I was escaping. It reminds me of a girl that I used to date. Lutefisk toots. Yes. Yes. Lutefisk toots. Between the spot where I stood and the Kelton where I lived. 3 blocks below, the street was half filled with debris. Fronts of buildings had crumbled out, effectively blocking all traffic. Under my feet in the subway from which I had escaped, I could hear the water hiss and boil. At first I wondered where the flood had come from, and then I suddenly remembered the tubes to Brooklyn and Long Island. They must have opened during the quake, allowing the river water to surge into the tunnels. I realized that I must find Mary and her mother and take them someplace of safety, if indeed any such spot existed upon the tortured earth. Other refugees have mentioned the same paralyzing experience, the thought that any calamity so tremendous must have been shared by every inhabitant of the globe. Before I reached the hotel, another shock made me reel in my tracks. That was the final disturbance, recorded at 47 minutes past 2 o'clock. Although it does not now seem possible that I was a half hour in extricating myself from the subway. Weakened, giddy, I fell on the street. Building fronts and stone cornices that had been loosened by the former shocks crashed to the pavement. Before my very eyes, the outer wall of a building rocked and slowly, majestically crumbled into a heap. I remember the squirrel nut zippers, JJ. It was a toot toot riot. JJ suggests lutefisk is best with lots of butter. I think that there is no way in which lutefisk is consumable. That was the Cherry Poppin' Daddies. Thank you. A room on the 4th floor was left exposed. In it, a baby grand piano hung precariously poised upon the very edge of the sagging floor. As I have said, there was no sound or sign of human life near me. I might almost have been in one of those dead cities like Pompeii, whose ruined dwellings are peopled only by ghosts. The open doorway of the hotel was partially blocked by carved stone decorations which had fallen from the facade at the 16th floor. One huge block had crashed through the pavement into the subway tunnel, leaving a black gaping hole in which the water gurgled. The menace of that hole made me dizzy. I crawled around it upon my hands and knees, afraid that I would be seized by vertigo and tumble in. I dragged myself into the lobby. Arthur Crown, the hotel accountant, was sitting there, quite at his ease. Except for him, the entrance was deserted. He had a candle for light, stuck upon a telephone cable, and he was smoking a cigarette. "Hello, Mr. Tenney," he called, waving me to a chair as casually as if he had been going to chat about baseball games or the weather. "Have a smoke." He looked more closely. "Good heaven, man, what happened to you? You're half drowned." "Subway," I gasped, steadying myself against the table. "I was in a train that was wrecked. The gas came in, and then the water. I swam. They were all drowned. The horror of it all was strongly upon me. They all drowned, a whole trainful, all drowned." He nodded understandingly. "Sit down," he insisted. "We're safer here than anywhere else. Skyscrapers like this are the only buildings that haven't been damaged. I tried to tell the guests that," he added, as if it were a cause for personal grievance on his part. "But they wouldn't stay here. Everybody ran for the open." "Where did they go?" "Search me." Crown shrugged his shoulders. "Do sit down." "No, thanks." Then I made the silliest speech of which I ever was guilty. "Please get my bill, Mr. Crown. I'm leaving." I'm assuming they drowned because the river water flooded through the entire subway tube. And those people were in pitch blackness and trapped. Yeah, JJ says, yeah, it was autoerotic asphyxiation. It was a whole train full of people. And they all died of autoerotic asphyxiation. Yeah, since it was, that's good. Yes. I like that explanation, JJ. Thank you. Yeah. Crown threw his head back and laughed until he was forced to wipe the tears from his eyes. When he was able to speak, he replied, "You're not checking out tonight, are you? I hope you're not displeased with our service." He doubled up with another burst of laughter. The sound of his mirth brought me to my senses as nothing else would have done. I grinned sheepishly and looked about the lobby. An elevator was wrecked in the shaft. Chandeliers had fallen. All the elaborate furnishings were in confusion, covered with plaster and plaster dust. "It's Miss Hull, the girl I'm engaged to," I explained. "We just became engaged tonight. I must find her." "Sure." Crown pointed to my dripping garments. "Better change your clothes, though, and if you have a gun, take it with you. There's looting already. Here, take this candle." He lighted a fresh taper from his own and passed it to me. "Let's see," he added. "Your brother checked out, didn't he?" For the minute I had forgotten Matt. "That's good," Crown said it heartily. "He must have gotten clear of the city before it happened." The steel stairs were not harmed. I climbed to my room on the 11th floor. Slowly I regained a hold upon myself. I stripped off my wet clothes, dressed in my warmest outing suit. I stuffed my money and a few trinkets in my pockets, loaded my old army automatic pistol, and fastened it in its holster to my belt. When I attempted to wash my hands, I discovered there was no water. A long time after that, we learned how the dams had burst at the artificial lakes. The flood that followed is an epochal story in itself. There was a little drinking water left in my pitcher. I took a long swallow and filled a pint bottle to carry with me. "So you're off?" Crown asked when I returned to the lobby. I nodded. "Help yourself to cigarettes." He pointed to the disordered corner that had been the cigar case. I blew out the candle and put the stub in my pocket. "Good luck to you." Crown shook hands. "I hope you find her safe. Remember, if there are any more shocks, the new buildings are the safest." Rathmore says, "If you have a gun," what is this, Texas? Was his gun from the war? So, like I said earlier, I don't know when this one was written. I'm guessing this is shortly after the First World War and not the Second War. "Are you left here all alone?" I asked. "There may be some people up in their rooms," he replied, "but I guess they all went out in the panic. It was unbelievable here then. They wouldn't listen to reason. Well, as I said, good luck." "Hey, Dio. We were just talking about your old girlfriends." I walked confidently around the hole in the pavement, which had unnerved me when I entered. Overhead, the stars were shining peacefully. Fangwood says after World War I, when drinking half a pint of scotch was like drinking for a couple of sexist brothers. Light drinking, yes. Chapter 2. Lexington Avenue was, as I have said, littered with wreckage. I could see no living creature on it. It seemed as if a whirlwind must have accompanied the earthquake, and, like a mammoth vacuum cleaner, swept up the thousands of men, women, and children who had lived along the street. Above 50th Street, the old stone and brick buildings that had so long been a disgrace to the neighborhood were almost entirely leveled, crumbled by the repeated shocks. Some walls had tumbled into the cellars, while others had spilled over like children's blocks upon the pavement. I don't even remember. Oh, this is the day Manhattan sank, I believe. Yeah, it's a little crazy. This is seriously straight up Pulp Fiction, Dio. JJ says prior to Prohibition, drink 31 gallons of alcohol a year was considered average in the US. That's 14 plus drinks a week. It is supple. Yeah, I'm sure I'm sure we'll discover this word somewhere in this story soon enough. All right. Mary Hull's apartment was on the west side of the city. I went toward Park Avenue without the slightest premonition of the difficulties I was to encounter. It seemed a simple matter to walk those 11 blocks that separated my hotel from her apartment house. Indeed, it was a strange betrothal night, an improbable, incomprehensible, and yet a fascinating experience. Less than 3 hours had passed since Mary promised to marry me, and I felt that I had lived through a week of terror. Minutes and yards are sometimes inadequate standards for measuring time and distance. Like Stanley, one may be able to throw a stone across a chasm and spend a month in reaching the spot where the pebble landed, or one may crowd into a single evening the adventures of a normal lifetime. My toe struck something soft and yielding that lay upon the pavement. I bent over and lighted a match, for the starlight was insufficient illumination to permit me to discover what this object might be. It was the body of a man face down upon the asphalt, the first of many bodies that I passed. In the man's arms was a paper-covered bundle containing his most treasured possessions, I suppose, which he had been carrying when a bit of stone rolled down from a roof and pinned him beneath it. I shivered and went on. We all know what he was carrying. He was carrying an armload of toilet paper because that's what you do in a crisis like this. Fangwad, 7 of 10 would propose to girlfriend on night of mass death again. I mean, it's something to celebrate, right? They'll look back on it with nostalgia in 50 years. I'm sure. At first glance, I thought the sumptuous apartment houses along Park Avenue had scarcely been harmed. Bond Boulevard, my brother Matt always called those multiple palaces. They were standing, having survived the crash in all their brick and stone magnificence. But a closer view showed the havoc that had been wrought. Like Lexington, Park Avenue was deserted. Whole sections of the pavement and sidewalk had dropped into the underground passage that lay beneath the street, the tunnel through which the New York Central trains passed to the Grand Central Station. These yawning holes were gigantic man-traps, for from them came the roar and hiss of surging water, showing that the passage had been flooded as well as the subway tubes. For a minute I thought it would be impossible for me to cross. However, I discovered that steel girders and even some sections of pavement remained to bridge the streets. Upon my hands and knees I crawled along a ragged steel beam to the center of the street, where a whole block of reinforced concrete had remained in place. There I stood, resting, while I looked up and down the thoroughfare, hoping to see one other survivor. In fact, I had begun to wonder if Crown, seated in the hotel lobby, and I were not the only residents of New York left alive. Fangwad says they'll be like, haha, remember that time in New York City when everyone died? Yes, exactly. Brush Guy says, I need to sign off. Can't keep my eyes open. It was a long day. Have a nice weekend, all of you. Good night, Brush Guy. Schlaf gut. Süße Trauma. The only residents of New York left alive. High up, perhaps, on the 10th floor of an apartment hotel a block below, a flickering candle had been placed in a window. Beside it a dark figure leaned upon the window sill, peering out at the desolation. I was seized with a fever to speak to someone. "Hello there," I called. "Hello there." The figure, it might have been either a man or a woman, withdrew the candle and closed the window, evidently frightened by my hail. In order to reach the opposite curb, it was necessary for me to crawl along the jagged steel beams, the skeleton of the street. As I neared the west sidewalk, I slipped, and for a breathtaking second I hung above the black hole of the tunnel. The water below seemed to rise up like a living monster to seize me. My left hand was cut on a sharp steel point, but I hung on and managed to go forward. The cross street on which I found myself at the end of this perilous journey was made impassable also by holes in the pavement, but I was able to make my way along, avoiding both the holes and the piles of stone and brick. In an open doorway of a shop stood a little dog. He quivered with fright even as he growled to warn me away from the stock he was guarding. Love Hamster would be a good 80s hair metal band. Would it? Would it? Between two large holes in the pavement, pinned in its place by a small avalanche of rubble from a building front, stood a large limousine. 5 men and 3 women were seated in it, all of them wearing evening dress, as if they were driving home from the opera. 2 of the men sat in the chauffeur's and footmen's places. The others were in the rear. All of them were smoking, but not speaking. It was obvious that the car could not move. They watched me with intent curiosity as I passed them. A man running at top speed turned the corner of Madison Avenue and almost knocked me down as he bumped into me. He was without hat or coat and wore neither collar nor tie. In his right hand he carried a number of bills which he grasped by the middle, crumpling them up as many crap shooters do in the excitement of a game. He solemnly handed me one of the banknotes. "I'm a stranger here," he announced breathlessly. "Can you tell me the best way to get out of the city?" "Good heavens, man, I don't know that myself." I returned his money. Plainly he did not comprehend my reply. "These damn foreigners don't understand English," he grumbled. Then turning he ran away from me, retracing his steps toward Madison Avenue. I followed him. I found Madison Avenue still passable, although greatly littered with brick and stone, glass and stucco. No cars were to be seen on it, and in fact no street in Manhattan was open for automobile traffic. The only machines I saw stood wrecked or abandoned at the curbs. Madison had become the route of many fugitives, all of them moving southward, toward the lower end of Manhattan. I joined this throng and walked with them until, nearly 42nd Street, we found our passage blocked by a twisted heap of steel and a great monument of stone that had been catapulted down. We turned westward through 43rd Street toward Fifth Avenue. One man who walked through that block beside me did not seem content, as the others were, to shuffle along silently with his eyes on the ground. "Went up to Central Park," he observed in the colorless monotone of a voice. "Couldn't get in. Dunno where to go." "You couldn't get in Central Park?" "Nope." His words came as if he had memorized them and was now repeating them in his sleep. "There ain't no room to stand in Central Park now." "You mean that there are so many people in Central Park that one can't find a place to stand?" "Yes, and when women faint, people walk on 'em. One girl didn't, though. There wasn't room for her to fall down, so she didn't get walked on." Our crowd halted. I climbed up a pile of debris that stood on the site of a building and looked over Fifth Avenue. Then it was possible for me to believe what he had told me about Central Park. No spectacle like that march up Fifth Avenue had ever before been staged for human eyes to witness. As far as I could see, the great traffic artery was packed solid with a moving mass of human beings. They filled the street from curb to curb without a break. Because of fallen material and stones, they could not swarm over the sidewalks. This was not a mob in the sense that the word is usually used. Rather, it was a muster of all humanity, pouring out of every street from every house, flat and rookery. It crawled uptown at a sick snail's pace, never quite halting, never really moving. It seemed to me like a river of cooling lava, almost congealed but forced onward by the infinity of pressure pounds behind it. It was a tremendous parade of the helpless and the hopeless, a mighty accumulation of individuals who had reached that crisis of despair when words are impossible. These tens of thousands had been stricken dumb by their common misfortune. Downtown New York was emptied into that one street, taking part in the pageant of wretchedness and fear. Rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief, doctor, lawyer, merchant, chief, all were there, rubbing elbows as they toiled along. I did not know how to cross that river of fugitives. It was more terrifying than any physical barrier. The individuals in it looked neither to the right nor the left, but plodded on. Before my eyes, almost close enough so that I might have helped him, an old man stumbled. He could not rise. The column moved on, grinding out his life beneath it. I took a deep breath, as if I were about to dive into ice water. "Excuse me, let me through," I shouted. No one heeded me. Hemmed in with men and women so close that their bodies pressed against mine, I was carried along with them. For a minute I was stupefied. Then I went mad, like an animal caught in a thicket. I felt certain that I would be sucked under by this human ebb tide. I used my fists, my knees, my hands and fists. I fought all the way through, inch by inch, always remembering the old man who had fallen and then been unable to rise, recalling how quickly the gap had closed up over him. Thank you, JJ. Just a Night with Richard Gere. Those persons who walked in the nightmare silence made no complaint as I struggled. By the time I had landed on the west curb, they had carried me 6 or 7 blocks toward Central Park with them. I staggered into a side street, which was deserted. On either side, the old brownstone residence had suffered considerably. Outer walls had fallen, leaving rooms exposed like stage settings. In the street was a cloud of plaster dust that burned one's eyes and partially obscured the starlight. Halfway through the block, as I approached Sixth Avenue, a girl suddenly appeared on an areaway, stepping gingerly over the wreckage that lay on the sidewalk. "Pardon me," she said. I could see that she was young and beautiful. She wore evening dress. Her bobbed hair was becomingly disordered. And a great jeweled silver snake bracelet was coiled about her upper arm. I stopped. "Please tell me your name." She asked it without the slightest hesitation or embarrassment. "Alexander Tenne. And I did live at the Kelton." "Your occupation, please?" The girl smiled. "I happen to be New York representative of the South Pacific Transportation and Trading Corporation." "Such luck," announced the girl. She took my hand and led me upstairs toward a room where I could hear voices and laughter. Although much plaster had fallen in the hall, showering the dark woodwork and wainscoting with a white volcanic dust, although the great glass chandelier had fallen, breaking the newel post and littering the floor with fine bits of glass, one could sense that the house belonged to and was occupied by people of wealth and good taste. Excuse me. I think I picked the wrong tea to drink while I was doing this today. Rathmore says, "This is a serious downer of a story." Yeah, vampire, right, Fangwad? It has to be vampires. They would thrive in chaos. At the top of the stairs, my pretty guide threw open a door and led me into a candle-lighted room. From the shadows beside a piano, 2 girls came forward into the circle of light. Excuse me. Sorry, I just had to get that out of my way. At the top of the stairs, my pretty guide threw open a door and led me into a candle-lighted room. Right? Story's so bad, Cathy had to retch. Yes. So, I warned you. These Pulp Fiction stories might be terrible. I'm waiting for something to actually happen besides the earthquake. There's like 3 things that have happened in this story in this whole time. From the shadows beside the piano, 2 girls came forward into the circle of light. One, blonde like my guide, was evidently her sister. The other, a strikingly dashing brunette, seemed vaguely familiar. 2 men also rose to greet me. "Permit me," began my guide. "Listen, everybody. May I present Mr. Alex Tenne of the South Pacific something or other? Anyway, it sounds interesting." She turned to me. My sister Allie is Vanderkel. I'm Julia. Instantly I remembered their identity. They were the daughters of an old Knickerbocker family, whose names and photographs had been spread over pages of Sunday newspapers 2 years before, when they renounced society to become glorified dancers in a Broadway revue. Scandal! What's the title? I'm pretty sure the title is The Day Manhattan Sank. Yeah, one of those three things is the title of the story. He proposed to his girlfriend. He said goodbye to his brother from upstate. Those are like the three things that have happened. It, yeah. The day Manhattan sank into boredom. I'm hoping that something else happens here at some point. I mean, he's just been invited into the household of flappers. So, you know, maybe this is where it gets interesting. Fangwad says he has a gun that's highly likely to come up again. Yes, he has a gun. This is Georgiana Lee. The dark girl nodded. I had seen her only 2 nights before. She was the prima donna of a popular light opera. I bowed. Franz Erck, the composer, Julia continued. We shook hands. She pointed to the remaining man, Cecil Henry. Having all confessed our right names, Georgiana said, with a little burst of silver laughter, let's get down to a little serious-minded drinking. But I can't stop, I murmured. Why? Demanded Julia. I'm looking for someone, one of my friends. For some unknown reason, I hesitated to say my fiancé. They live on the west side. I'm on my way there. Bet you 100 she's not at home, said Georgiana, while the others roared with laughter. Erck took a bottle of champagne from a bucket of ice and water. He poured some of the wine into each of 6 glasses, then filled them up to the brim with anisette. Quicker action, he explained. We'll have to drink the wine first anyway, because our ice won't keep. Thank goodness, said Georgiana. I can get tight without worrying over tomorrow's matinee. Julia and I were sitting on a cushioned window seat. I can't stay here, child, I protested. I must go. Damn it, I've got to find my friends. Of course you'll stay. You won't be able to find anybody. You'll just make yourself unhappy searching for them. Julia dismissed the matter. After the show tonight, she continued, Georgiana and the boys came up here for a drink. We were all talking when... She shivered slightly. It happened. My friend, Carl Watkins, you know, ran out. It was a minute before she finished her story. Some of the wall fell. His body's there on the steps under those stones. I ran down after him, so I saw it. Her breath came quickly, then she recovered and finished in quite a matter-of-fact tone. Then I saw you coming, and you looked so alone, too, so I brought you up. We thought if we all stayed together we wouldn't be so frightened. Her voice broke. You don't understand. I made a final weak protest. I must find my friend, you see. It's the girl I'm engaged to. But you won't find her. You'll be lost or crushed in the street. It's hopeless. Isn't it better to stay here among friends than be trampled out there? Here, at any rate, we can be gay tonight, even if there is no tomorrow. Someone struck a chord upon the piano. No tomorrow, no tomorrow, the girl repeated. She must have recognized the composer's touch upon the keys, for she did not look up to see who was playing. The idea stimulates Franz, just as it does me. Listen, he's improvising. I surrendered to her logic. After all, she was right. There would be no tomorrow. It was better to meet the end with gaiety here than to be trampled under the feet of fear-maddened fugitives. How could I hope to find Mary? The piano rumbled with a peculiar kettle-drum syncopation done upon the bass. Then it picked up a thread of melody, set in strangely harmonious negroid minors. Twice the composer played it through. Is he talking about jazz? Let me just stop. Is he talking about jazz? Satan's music? I'm appalled. Appalled. Shocked. Scandalized. Ha ha, Rathmore, a Chekhov brand gun. It was Chekhov's gun all along. Yeah, you know. Then he repeated the kettle drum introduction and saying, Angel Gabriel's a comin' to the earth. Listen to the trumpet of the Lord. Gabriel's a blowin' now for all he's worth. It's just a song and I don't feel like singing. It goes on. Hark to the word of Israel. The first time he sang it mockingly, inventing words to fit the irresistible beat of the melody. Then, as the words became fixed in his and our minds, he chanted it again with all the fire and spirit of a camp meeting convert. It echoed through that house like the call to the judgment seat. Play something else, implored Georgiana, or leave that piano alone. It recalled me to my senses. I rose to my feet. What's the matter? Julia pleaded. Don't mind Franz's music. He has fits like that. Sorry, I said. I really must go on. I said goodbye and hurried down the stairs and out into the street. I carefully avoided stepping on the heap of stones and bricks beneath which Julia's friend Carl was buried. In spite of the fact that 6th Avenue was littered with the wreckage of the elevated line, many refugees were moving along it, a crowd that had eddied back from the congestion near Central Park. I was caught in this human maelstrom and carried along to 40th Street. Before I could free myself, I found Broadway nearly impassable, with great holes in the pavement above the subways. It was with considerable difficulty that I crossed Broadway and 7th Avenue. Outside the entrance of the Herald Tribune building, a man was seated on a stone, fixedly regarding the people who passed and repassed near him. There was something familiar about his posture. I walked closer and recognized the man. He was Tom McKay, with whom I had worked in my own reporter days. He had become a sort of night wire editor for this paper's news service. Hello, Tom. Of all the people in the city of New York, this guy runs into people that he knows. Right, Fangwad? I mean, granted, there were slightly less people there in the 20s, but not that many less. Why, it's Alex Tenney. He shook hands as casually as if we met in the newspaper club. How's Alex? What are you doing here? I demanded. I'm thinking, Tom groaned. Hell, imagine a story like this breaking and here I can't print it or even put it on the wire. Just my luck. I'd like to file 10,000 words. The whole damn world is waiting, and I'm burning to tell 'em, and I can't even get a bulletin out. Come with me, Tom, I suggested. We'll try to get out of the city and we'll find a wire somewhere. Nah, he shook his head emphatically. Got to stay here. Maybe some of the staff will show up. If they do, I'll set 'em to work. I got one fellow in there now, right in the lead. He jerked his thumb toward the interior of the building. I'll try to send the first story out by messenger if I can find a boy. With a story like this breaking, he grumbled, I ought to have a full staff. I'll take your story with me if you like. I'm going to get out of the city. Tom's face lighted. Honest? Then wait a minute. He ran inside, reappearing shortly with some ragged sheets of copy paper. Here's a lead and about 2,000. Mark it follow and file it as soon as you can. I stuffed the manuscript into my pocket. Tom slapped my back in hearty good nature. Think of it, Alex. With a What a head you could put on a story like this. A two-line streamer of 146-point type. Millions die in Manhattan. You wouldn't ask for anything nicer than setting up a page like that. Millions dead. Your praiseworthy desire for alliteration is getting the best of you, Tom. Sure, there must be. Tom indignantly defended his own estimate of the casualties. Why, everybody's dead that lived below Bleecker Street, and the last shock took all those that were left up to 14th. You don't mean... Didn't you know? The lower end of the island sunk. It went right down into the drink at the second shot. At the time of the third shock, it crumbled off clear up to 14th. Think what that means. World's greatest financial district and the most congested tenements in the world, all at the bottom of the harbor. I wanted to do parallel stories, one dealing with the human loss and one about the financial district. Biggest gold reserve in history is hundreds of feet underwater. Huh. They'll find a new kind of fish in the stock exchange." His voice rose to a thin treble whine. "I ask you, is it right? I can't send a word of it." I could scarcely believe the news. "Are you sure?" "Of course I am. I've talked with people who saw it. The fellow who's writing this went and looked for himself. He nearly got caught. By the way, where were you when it happened?" I told him how I had been trapped in the subway. "Then you better add a few hundred words of description to the story," Tom directed. "Don't forget, and send it off as soon as you can. Every press on the map is waiting for it. Goodbye, Alex." Before I was out of earshot, he called after me, "Don't forget to put on our copyright line." I waved my arm to reassure him. Tom McKay cared little what the news might be. It was his job to collect and distribute it, impersonally as an archangel. A million dead was to him a mere matter of type, a 146-point streamer in the same way as an automobile accident meant a short paragraph on an inside page. Rathmore says, "Fun fact, there is a fault line that runs up Manhattan. It's extinct, but it could always wake up." That is a fun fact. With comparatively little more trouble, I reached the luxurious apartment house on West 45th Street where Mary Hall and her mother lived. I was relieved to see that, relatively speaking, it was undamaged. I slipped in the wrecked doorway and, after lighting several matches, found the staircase. As I climbed to the 6th floor, I wondered if all my efforts had not been futile. Almost everyone had sought safety in the open air. Hours had passed since the shocks. But Mary Hall was calm, clear-headed, and intensely practical. Moreover, she was responsible for the safety of her invalid mother. Except, as a last resort, I was sure she would not have exposed the older woman to the excitement and the dangers of the street. I reached the door of their suite and rapped. There was no sound. My heart sank. After the spectacles I had witnessed upon the streets, I realized how little chance there was that I would ever see them again. I then attempted to force the door, thinking I would leave a note for them in case they returned. "Who's there?" came in a man's voice, which I recognized as Bob Whiston's. "Alex. Alex Tenney." "I knew he'd come. I knew he'd come." Mary's tone expressed infinite relief. The door swung open. The room behind it was as dark as the hall where I was standing. Whiston seized my arm and drew me inside, while Mary quickly closed the door. "I'll light a candle. I brought one," I told them. "We don't dare," Mary protested. "It isn't safe." "There are men about the building who are looting. We've heard terrible things, and once they tried to come in here." I struck a match and lighted the candle stub. Then I flipped back my coat and showed them the butt of my pistol. The lighted candle put everyone more at their ease. Whiston lighted a cigar, and the atmosphere seemed less tense. "When did you come?" I asked Whiston. "Immediately after the second shock. I was at the club, and I ran here intending to get my car and drive them to a place of safety, but as soon as I saw the streets I realized how little driving would do." "You've been sitting here in the dark ever since?" "We wouldn't let him go out for a candle," Mrs. Hull explained. "Those men are about." There was no use of distressing the women by telling them that the lower end of Manhattan was under water, and that another shock might submerge the very district where we were. I insisted, and Whiston agreed with me, that it would be wise for us to walk north until we reached the high rock ridge near Riverside Drive, the highest part of the island. Mrs. Hull said she felt strong enough to attempt the walk, and that she was sure she would feel happier in the open air. Although nothing was said about it, I sensed that both Mrs. Hull and Whiston had guessed Mary's and my understanding. Whiston, poor fellow, shook hands with quite unnecessary fervor, and assured me I was damned lucky, which I did not think applied solely to my escape from the perils of the flooded subway. "Hey, Cookie." "Yeah, drat, no more double solitaire for me." Rathmore says, "I'm realizing that this was written after the San Francisco earthquake, which is probably where the author got some ideas of what it would be like in New York City." "Yeah, that's probably correct, Rathmore." "This is definitely the 1920s. Well, early 20s, I would think." "I don't know. When was the San Francisco earthquake?" 1917? Okay. I told Mary and her mother to put on warm clothing and to collect their valuables. While they went in the bedroom to dress, taking the candle stub with them, I told Whiston in low tones, what had happened to Lower New York. It seems to me, I concluded, that our best plan is to get up to the higher part in case there is another shock, even if we can't cross the Harlem River at 160th Street. Relief will eventually come from that direction. He assented. Anything's better than waiting here like this. We would have gone before, but Mary insisted that you might come. He hesitated and then added, "It would have been pretty tragic if you hadn't." Just then we heard a voice in the hall outside the door. Whiston whispered the one word, "Looters." "Bring that axe," a man called. "Here's that door we couldn't open." "Did Mary lock it when she let you in?" queried Whiston under his breath. Evidently she had not, for as I rose, drawing my pistol and slipping off the safety catch, the first man spoke again. "This door ain't locked now." The door opened, admitting two vague figures, both of them carrying electric torches, which they turned full on me. "Put up them dukes, you," growled the first. "We're taking up a collection for them that's rendered homeless by the quake." I fired before he finished his sentence. Although I am no crack shot, I was only 10 feet away, and one cannot miss at that distance. The heavy pistol barked like a cannon in the small room. I heard Mrs. Hull scream. The man pitched forward toward me, falling on his face. His electric torch, still burning, rolled across the floor and under the table. The second man snapped off his light, and the room was dark again. I bent over to secure the flashlight. That movement saved my life. The second man fired, and the bullet crashed into the wall near the spot where my head had been. I lost my balance and fell heavily upon the body of the man I had shot. Instantly, the man in the doorway, believing he had killed me, turned his torch on Whiston. "Don't you get fresh," he warned Bob, covering him with his pistol. He made a perfect target for me as he stood there, his light in his left hand. I rolled half over, pointed my pistol at him, and pulled the trigger. I was so close that the powder flame burned his coat and vest. He stumbled, coughed, and toppled over. "Alex, Alex," Mary called from the bedroom. "Are you hurt?" "No." Then I saw the gleam of a moving bull's-eye of light in the corridor. Evidently other members of the gang were outside. I rolled over the bodies to the door and fired at the source of the light. 2 shots replied. I fired again and heard the sound of men running down the stairs. "It's all right, Mary," I shouted to reassure her. Then I secured the torches that had dropped from the intruder's hands. Bob armed himself with one of the looters' pistols, so that we could both be ready in case the gang returned. We dragged the bodies into the corridor, covering them up with the blood-soaked rug from the living room, so that Mary and her mother would be spared the sight. I scouted ahead for looters, while the others followed me quickly down the stairs. It had been starlight night when I entered the building, and when we emerged day was near. The stars were dimmed by a yellow flood in the east. A half-twilight veiled the street. About ruined buildings hung a fog of plaster dust. Somewhere north and east a great column of smoke was rising upward. But we found the street filled with water. I did not understand where it had come from, but Bob Whiston was shrewder. "I wonder if there will be another," he whispered. Another what? Another tidal wave. For the first time that night I really despaired. Big Jim Slade says also 1906. 1906, 1890, 1856, 1989. Chapter 3. Oh, how many chapters are there? This is only chapter 3? Okay. Maybe it's a short story. Daylight came slowly, as if the sun were reluctant to disclose the havoc and ruin which the night had partially obscured. As we reached the higher ground, where the flood of the tidal wave had not inundated the streets, the district seemed less like a city of the dead. There are no words in the language to describe the homeless, bewildered persons we met. Our plans were vague enough. We knew that we hoped to reach the upper end of the island. There we thought we might find some way of crossing the Harlem River and reaching the mainland, but the people on the streets, moving about as they were in groups that varied in size from a dozen to 1,000 persons, seemed to have no plan, and also to have lost all sense of direction. By irregular routes, they walked round and round the blocks where their homes had been. As the light increased, we observed more details, noted some of the vagaries of the quake's action. Some blocks of stores and apartments were absolutely leveled. Nearby it would be another section apparently built of the same material, which seemed to have escaped serious damage. Fangwad, Chapter 3, in which Cathy sounds like she just wants it to end. I'm waiting for the island to just finally sink all together. Eventually, we were forced toward Broadway. There, in spite of the holes in the pavement, we were able to make more rapid progress, for we were less hindered by the crowds of fugitives. We passed hundreds of abandoned perambulators and go-karts. Soon after the first shocked parents had attempted to wheel their children, and then, seized by a sudden terror, they had picked them up and carried them in their arms. Near 50th Street we found 4 men hammering with iron sledges upon a safe which they had dragged from the wrecked box office of a motion picture theater. I held my pistol ready for service, but they paid no attention to us as we passed. I was impressed by the fact that almost every man we met needed a shave. I do not know why I should have observed this, but it stands out as one of the curious things I noticed. And I also noted that many women had clung to their vanity cases. Girls who were wearing only nightgowns, bathrobes, and slippers, there were many such, seemed to have carried paint and powder in their hands as their only baggage. Near Columbus Circle, we noticed a sheet stretched tent fashion over the sidewalk, between 2 heaps of stone that had fallen from a building front. As we came close to it, we saw a young woman resting under this frail canopy. She was nursing a small baby, and at the same time, perfectly oblivious to our presence, was lining her eyebrows and lips with black and red pencils that she took from her wrist bag. On the crest of the hill near 60th Street, we halted and looked back. Strangely enough, the skyline of Manhattan had suffered little change that we could see. Most of the big buildings stood intact, although some of the curtain walls and most of the ornamentation and fresco work had been shaken down. Generally speaking, the steel frame buildings, in which the weight of the side walls, floors, and roofs is carried by steel posts, had suffered little harm. Blah, blah, blah. Older and lower buildings, belonging to the type known as wall-bearing construction. This is a guy who did way, way too much research into architecture when he wrote this story, and then used all of the information. Whenever the condition of the street permitted it, our little party walked 4 abreast. Bob Whiston and I walked on either side of Mrs. Hull in order to help her as much as possible. Mary walked on my left. Through it all, she and her mother were perfectly composed. Mary, clear-eyed, her light hair scarcely disordered, her smile ready any time that I glanced at her, was wearing a tweed suit and square-toed walking shoes. In that costume she was chic enough to be bound for some pleasure excursion instead of being in flight from a doomed city. Mrs. Hall was marvelous. Although she had been a semi-invalid for years and had been sheltered from every exertion, every anxiety, every care, she rose magnificently to the crisis. Not once did she complain. Bob Whiston thought of breakfast. He turned us down a side street and made for a doorway. Over it was a delicatessen sign. Instantly I realized that I was ravenously hungry. We found the doorway half blocked with loose brick that had tumbled down from the wall above. Bob entered with some difficulty, and passed out what provisions he could find to me. Others had been there before, it seemed. Since there were looters already in this establishment, these people doing looting was nothing bad. They weren't doing anything wrong. They were just looting some food. The breakfast consisted of a jar of pickled lamb's tongues, a tin of tea biscuits, a cake of pimento cheese, and several bottles of mineral water. Mrs. Hull laughed at the assortment of food. A perfect breakfast, exactly what I would order for myself. The mineral water, with a dash of whiskey from Bob's flask, was a godsend. We had all of us been more conscious of thirst than of hunger, and I was saving my pint of drinking water for an emergency later in the day. After we had eaten, we gave the food and water that remained to a foreign woman and her twin sons, who had watched us with wolfish eyes. To escape being involved in the mob near Central Park, we walked west. On a street corner, a uniformed policeman stopped us. His face was badly cut, and there was a mass of congealed blood upon his tunic. In one hand he held his nightstick. In the other he carried an empty glass jug. At first, as he approached us, I thought he was insane. "Know where there's any milk?" he demanded. "No." "Or water?" I shook my head. "I got to get milk and water," he explained. "I got about 30 kids in there." He pointed to the ruined front of a store that had been an automobile sales room. "I got to feed 'em somehow, and they're crying thirsty now." Mary solved the problem. "Did you try the soda fountain in the drugstore?" Across the street, behind a hole in the pavement that marked the route of the subway, was the caved-in entrance to a neighborhood pharmacy. The policeman stared at it and then grinned. "We might find something there at that, miss." "Let mother rest for a few minutes," Mary told us. "We'll try to find some food." Mrs. Hull sat down upon the curb. The policeman and Bob dragged a plank from a wrecked scaffolding and used it to bridge the hole in the pavement. I crossed, making my entrance into the store through the shop window. The others followed. With a cry of delight, Mary unearthed several quarts of milk, a freezer of chocolate ice cream, a case of bottled water and soft drinks, a gallon of drinking water, and added to this supply of rations the store's stock of malted milk and chocolate. The policeman beamed as he surveyed the food. "Damn," he remarked, with infinite satisfaction. "They'll think I'm going to throw a party for 'em." He stepped to the window and bellowed, "Tim! Come here, Tim!" In answer to the hail, a city fireman appeared, taking the provisions as the policeman passed them out and carrying them across the street to the nursery. "Tim's my nurse girl," the policeman confided to us. "I was lucky to find him. Them kids has to have a lot of things done for 'em, and Tim's a married man. I ain't," he added apologetically, blushing deeply out of respect to Mary. He confessed his bachelorhood as if he thought he had been remiss in his duty. Meanwhile, Mary had rummaged through the stock shaken from the shelves behind the prescription desk and located a first aid pack. In spite of his protests, "Don't bother with me, miss," she made the man sit down while she washed and dressed his wound. She must have tortured him when he applied the iodine, for the flesh had been literally stripped from his cheekbone. He sat there through it all, making no complaint. "If I ever catch me the bozo who give me this," he promised, when he had finished, "that lad'll think he met up with another quake. It was right after them first 2 shocks. I seen him throw an older fellow and a woman out of their auto. He pitched them out on the street and was going to ride off by himself. I grabs him, but he up and clocks me with a monkey wrench and got away." "Where was that, officer?" "Here on this corner, miss." The policeman inspected the bandage, admiring it in the fragment of mirror that remained behind the soda fountain. "Say, you ought to been a doctor. Well, the boy must have knocked me out. When I come to, I had a fight with a mob on my hands. Then Tim come along. Since then, him and me has been collecting our orphan asylum. We ha ha ha. We got all the ethnic slurs here." All the ethnic slurs. "And some we ain't been able to classify." It didn't actually say all the ethnic slurs. That was me. I'm just paraphrasing so that I don't have to actually read those words out loud. Mary, quite frankly, admired him. "I think it was a wonderful thing for you and Tim to do." "Oh, no, miss." He looked at her with blue-eyed wonder. "Somebody had to do it, and we was here. You'd be surprised, though," he added, "how careless folks was with their kids last night." "What about your own relatives and Tim's wife and children?" The policeman looked away. "No use worrying about them, except we'll have a mass said. They lived way downtown below Greenwich Village, and they never had no chance to get out. It's all under water now." Wow, this really is an uplifting story. Bob Whiston took his card from his pocket and scrawled upon it the address of his firm in Chicago. He handed this to the officer. "You're too good a man to lose track of," Bob remarked. "Let me hear from you." We all shook hands. Big Jim Slade says, "Why did it have to be downtown and not, say, Yankee Stadium?" Oh, they're too cruel. They're too cruel, Big Jim. We all shook hands. Good luck, officer. Good luck to you, and thanks, miss. I'll tell them kids that their party is on you. As I write, other memories of that morning's walk flood back upon me. Flood. The sun, red as flames of a great fire in Harlem on our right, blazed down upon us. The panic of the fugitives somewhat diminished. During the hours of darkness scarcely one person had spoken to another. Now they resumed speech, and the wildest rumors flew from group to group with incredible speed. On one corner we heard that the entire Atlantic seaboard had been destroyed. Boston, Newport, Philadelphia were said to be razed. On the next corner a woman was telling how the inland cities had suffered even more than Manhattan. She said Chicago was swallowed up. Of course, there was absolutely no foundation for these tales. Manhattan had no means of communicating with the outside world since the first shock. Nevertheless, everyone seemed to believe the most improbable things. You see, in a time of crisis, things haven't changed in 100 years, as it turns out. Somewhere along our route we found the preacher. About 1,000 men and women were gathered around him. He was an oldish, undersized man, wearing threadbare clothes and standing upon a heap of wreckage which had once been a house. His voice, shrill and penetrating, reached us perfectly on the outskirts of the crowd. "Brothers, ye failed to heed the handwritin' on the wall," he spoke in a sing-song chant. "So look about. See this great city destroyed for its wickedness. Yea, like Sodom, it is cast down to perish. Ye have yet time to repent. We are not yet ripe grain for the sickle of the reaper." "Amen. Praise the Lord," cried a man. "Have heed lest ye be pulled up with the tares, lest ye be cut down unrighteous in the flower of thy youth, lest unwilling and unprepared ye be summoned before the throne." "Amen, amen," several repeated. "Brethren, this is the day of the Lord's harvest. Are ye ready to be judged?" "No, I ain't ready to be judged. I ain't ready for the reaper." A huge colored woman, the largest I have ever seen outside of a sideshow tent, called out her answer to the preacher's question. She made her majestic way through the crowd that parted before her until she was close to the rubble that served as a pulpit. There she flung herself down. "Hear me, Lord. I ain't ready, Lord. I ain't fit to be reaped." "Our sister seeks repentance," shrilled the preacher. "Who is there to repent her? Who is there to repent with her?" He extended his arms imploringly. "Is there only one in all Sodom to be saved? Send us a sign, Lord, send us a sign." He looked up to the sky, perhaps self-hypnotized into the belief that he would see a flaming chariot. My gaze followed his, and as it did, my ears caught a sound they might not heard for hours, the purring of a motor. The roar of the motor grew louder. Then from behind a banked eastern cloud a great plane dived into view. A gasp of astonishment, almost of fear, went up from the preacher's congregation. As the plane came closer, I was thrilled to notice the United States Army markings upon wings and body. "It's going to bomb us," called some man who evidently believed he was back in a war zone. JJ, who is ready to repent with her, reminds me of a girl Dio used to date. That's three. Are they the same girl or three different girls? The plane dipped over Central Park, and from it fluttered down thousands of scraps of paper. Again and again the plane turned, climbed, dipped like a hawk over a grain field. It seemed like an age before it circled near us, and some of the sheets of paper quivered down in our vicinity. But long before they reached us, the flyer had disappeared, sailing toward Brooklyn. There was a mad rush for the precious scraps because, in a crisis, right, you want toilet paper. In spite of Mary and her mother's protest, I joined the milling thousands who were waiting with outstretched hands to snatch one of the sheets from the air. One fluttered near. I jumped, seized it, and fought my way back through the press of excited men to Mary and her mother. The preacher was forgotten. Bob displaced him on the rostrum and read the message aloud to the gathering. Executive proclamation to the people of the city of Greater New York. The nation joins me in sending you every possible expression of sympathy. The nation promises immediate and tangible aid. The calamity which you have suffered is without parallel in the history of mankind. It has shocked the world. Relief work is being organized as this is written. To facilitate it, the officer commanding the military in the stricken area will enforce strict martial law. Because of the unparalleled interruption of transportation, it may not be humanly possible for relief trains to reach you today. Remain calm. Remember that every resource of the government, the entire strength of the Army and Navy, the facilities of many corporations and private individuals are being taxed to supply your needs. The proclamation dated at Washington at 4 o'clock that morning was signed by the President of the United States. I believe that those handbills distributed by plane did more real good than any other single item of relief work. The preacher attempted to resume his sermon. His words fell upon deaf ears. Bob Whiston thought it would be wise for us to return to the apartment and wait there until aid arrived, but I insisted that because of the shortage of food and water, our best plan was to push forward and meet the relief columns. About noon we reached 165th Street. Looking down from the cliff where the Polo Grounds had stood, we saw that the usually placid Harlem River that separates Manhattan from the mainland had been on a terrific rampage. The whole valley was strewn with wreckage. The tidal wave had swept between the cliffs, demolishing every structure that the quake had spared. Against the stone piers of ruined bridges great heaps of driftwood had been piled. 2 miles above, at High Bridge, we could see a few adventurous men crossing from the New York to the Bronx bank, walking with comparative safety upon the wrecked boats, scows, houses, wooden piers, and houseboats which the water had piled into a huge misshapen heap. This was ground upon the pier stumps and the ruins of the great stone causeway. "There's our only chance to get across." Bob pointed to it. "If those men can cross there," replied Mrs. Hall, "I think we can manage too." To understand how this river barrier had come into existence, one must imagine the miles of docks and shipping that stretched from the Brooklyn Heights district and the Battery on either bank of the East River. Do we really need this description? We all know. We all know how this happened. There's a shit ton of stuff, and the river just piled it up. Right? We can move on. As we approached the barricade on the High Bridge piers, the river had sunk back to its normal level, although a strong current held downstream, running from the Hudson River toward the bay. A wrecked ferryboat rested on the mud and rocks of the Manhattan bank. We climbed through it to the upper deck, and from there managed to reach the top of the wreckage, fully 50 feet above the water. "Giants have been playing jackstraws with our belongings," said Mrs. Hull to Mary. Beneath our feet, heaped up by forces whose power dwarfs man's comprehension, were huge harbor lighters. They might have been knickknacks of a child's playroom, drifted to one end of a bathtub. Great timbers that had been piled in heavy planks were twisted by the pressure into fantastic shapes. It was something like a log jam, except that the component parts were larger than any logs. A half dozen wooden freight cars, swept up from some railroad yard, were mere infinitesimal portions of the whole. It was easy to see why more persons had not used the wreckage as a bridge. Every foot of progress from the west to the east bank meant climbing over barriers, all so slippery that we constantly risked a fall to the riverbed. Mary made her way without assistance, but Bob and I had to lift her mother bodily at times. So we toiled across, paying no heed to shouts of "Look out there!" that came from a group of men on the bank we had quitted. Once I peered over the edge of the pile and thought I noticed the water beneath us was running more swiftly. A mangled yacht, quite a fine one, barred our path. It lay on its side, but a jagged hole in the hull permitted us to crawl into the cabin and up the companionway to the deck. There we let ourselves down on a mass of tangled planking and railroad ties. The last barrier was a sort of raft, perhaps a former floating wharf. Maybe this is how rafts started. There we let ourselves down on a mass of tangled planking. I already read that. Ah, the last barrier was a sort of raft, perhaps a former floating wharf. As we were climbing up it, I felt a movement beneath my feet. Startled, I looked upstream. The tidal wave was returning. The water had been sent up the Hudson River, between the Palisades, until it massed below the Flats and Albany. Now the whole tremendous flood was sweeping back towards the sea. It was coming down the channel like a torrent that follows a broken dam. It was a great swelling racing tide that carried whole houses on its crest. Even as I looked, a preliminary movement made the wreckage creak and groan. A higher wave was close behind. In another moment we would be swept away. I took Mrs. Hull in my arms, shouted a desperate "Quick!" to Mary and Bob Whiston, and climbed up the slippery timbers that were canted toward us. I missed my footing and fell heavily. Mrs. Hull was not injured. Mary and Bob helped me to my feet. We struggled on. Wait just a minute," groaned Bob, as if he were pleading with a reasoning force. Tight-lipped and tense, Mary offered no protest or complaint. Dirty, muddy, foam-specked water boiled up beneath our feet. The planks moved. A great snapping and screeching told of the strain upon the timbers. The raft or platform was tilted at an angle of almost 30 degrees toward the center of the river. The flood poured over the top of the barricade. We stood helpless, and I realized that we were lost. Suddenly, as we were about to be drawn back into the maelstrom, the water raised under the outer edge. The whole mass of wreckage heaved. Our raft righted and then tilted forward, literally catapulting us across it and landing us safe upon the terraced platform of the Parkway, above the site of the old High Bridge Railroad station. Just as we reached the secure footing of masonry and rock, the river seemed to mark us as its victims. Mary and Bob were a step in advance. I handed Mrs. Hull to them when the water rose and reached my waist. It would have sucked me downward had not Mrs. Hull held the lapels of my coat with a tenacity and muscular strength one would not have dreamed was concealed in her thin white hands. For a moment we all tottered on the brink. Then they dragged me ashore. As I turned to look back, the crest of the flood passed, carrying with it out to sea every stick of that great jam that had composed our bridge. Exhausted by the physical and mental strain of those few tortured seconds, we sat down. It was some time before anyone spoke. "Gosh," Bob sighed, "that was a close connection." We all laughed hysterically. We finished the whiskey in Bob's flask, and then walked slowly up the hill toward the Grand Concourse and the Boston Post Road. Although the shocks had not been as severe as the Bronx had not been as severe in the Bronx as in Manhattan Island, the miles of apartment houses seemed to have suffered more than the buildings in downtown New York. Engineers say that this was due to improper methods of construction. In the main, however, the scenes were identical to those we had witnessed before. There were the same helpless, surging crowds of fugitives. As we approached a corner, Mary seized my arm. "Look!" She pointed to a message printed in chalk upon a wall of one of the few undamaged buildings. "There's your name." Someone had printed Alex Tenney there. Below my name was an arrow pointing out the Boston Post Road, and below that the words, "Watch the arrows, about 3 miles." Is it his brother? Did his brother get caught? Uncomprehendingly, I stared at the message. I was the only Alex Tenney listed in the New York phone book. Telephone directory, but I could not imagine who had this interest in communicating with me. A few blocks farther on, we saw the same message again. We proceeded with no little difficulty through mobs that either stood listlessly in the street or moved to and fro in ceaseless, aimless wanderings. Then we heard traffic whistles. The people opened a road through the center of the street. There's a long column of infantrymen, 4 abreast, route marching. The men were dirty, tired, sweating, burdened with full cartridge belts, and packs from which protruded their packages of emergency rations. A wild, hoarse cheer went up from the refugees who lined their path. A first lieutenant walked smartly at the head of the column. He kept calling out, "Rations in the rear, folks, rations in the rear." The regiment filed past, their colors cased as if they were moving into a war zone. Following them came an engineers battalion with its train, their pontoons for bridges hauled by tractors. Next was a smart squadron of cavalry, preceding a complete field hospital. Then came miles of motor trucks, commandeered from corporations and private owners, but manned by soldiers. The trucks literally groaned under the weight of supplies. "You'll find a tent city and rolling kitchens about 4 miles, called the men. It seemed that the column would never end. Behind the army units was a Navy and Marine relief train from the Boston Navy Yard. More soldiers followed them with supply trains, artillery batteries, although the horses hauled loaded wagons instead of guns. It seemed like a view of troops pouring into a captured city. When the final detachment had passed, we walked northward again. At frequent intervals we found the Alex Tene message with the arrow pointing. In the late afternoon I discovered the final guide sign. The name had been printed upon a board nailed to a tree, and the arrow pointed down to a handsome closed car that was parked below it. "There's my friend," I remarked. "I'm afraid he won't give us a ride," Bob returned. "There are no wheels on that car." It was true. The wheels had been taken off and the car jacked up on piles of bricks. Because of course. "Maybe he thought you'd bring wheels with you," Mary suggested. I went closer. 2 men were sleeping inside the car. My hand was upon the door before I realized the identity of one of them. "Matt!" I shouted. "Matt!" My brother sat up. The interior of the car was piled high with something that was covered by a blanket. He greeted us casually as if the meeting was the most natural thing in the world. "Hello, folks." Matt rubbed his eyes. He expressed no surprise at seeing us there together. With another person this matter-of-fact attitude might have been a pose. With him it was merely a logical conclusion of a natural phenomenon, which he would no more question than he would a rainy morning in April. "Have a good lurk, JJ. Bon appetit." "I waited around here," Matt said, "because I thought maybe you'd like to run up to that farm for a few days." "I thought maybe you'd like to run up to my farm for a few days. That is," he grinned, "if you can spare the time from your offices." He shook the man asleep beside him. "Wake up, Skinny. Our gang's here." The companion, a youth I had never seen before, jumped down from his bed. "Skinny hired out to pick apples for me." Matt nodded at his helper. "I hired him between the second and third shocks last night, after the train ran off the track at Peekskill." "Can't we get some wheels for your car?" Bob Whiston was plainly puzzled at Matt's attitude. He was not quite sure that Matt was sane. "Of course I have the wheels. I've been sleeping on them." Matt hauled them out from beneath the robes. "I thought if we hid 'em, nobody would try to take this bus away from us. There's something discouraging in trying to steal a car without wheels." Okay, that was genius. That was genius. Of course I have the wheels. "Skinny and I'll put 'em on while you eat. Then we'll get rolling." We ate soup, beans, and hardtack at a cavalry rolling kitchen. Then I found a signal corps telegraph, and for a small consideration prevailed upon the sergeant in charge of it to send the news story which Mackay had given me. Matt explained the presence of the car. "I met Skinny and hired him. Then we decided to come back from Peekskill to find you. The road was full of automobiles then. We were looking for a car when 2 fellas came along with this. They didn't look to me as if they owned it, so I stopped 'em and asked to see their license. They jumped out and ran away. So seeing they'd abandoned it, I thought I'd take care of it for the real owner." By daylight we had driven far out of the quake zone. About lunchtime we reached Matt's farm. I slept nearly 24 hours. When I finally awoke, bathed, shaved, and ate, my brother's housekeeper informed me that Mrs. Hull was resting comfortably, little the worse for her adventure. "Bob Whiston," she said, "had gone to Chicago on business." "Where's Mary?" "Your brother took her down to the packing house. They are loading a car of fruit, and she wanted to see it." Mary was there, seated upon a nail keg, watching Matt's skillful movements as he pressed and headed the barrels of apples which Skinny rolled to a waiting truck. There was nothing in the appearance of any of them to suggest that they had seen a city wrecked, the most complex civilization of the modern world destroyed. "Why," I exclaimed, "you're shipping out fruit." "Sure." Matt's sardonic expression reminded me of the night before the quake, when he stood upon the hotel roof and told me how unimportant New York really was. "You didn't expect me to quit work because the New York market is gone, did you?" "People eat apples in other cities." He tightened the chime hoop. "That's what I tried to tell you," he added. "All the importance of New York, all your importance and the importance of your friends, existed in your mind." Matt drove a nail. "It fooled others besides you. Markets were all shot to the devil yesterday, but they've recovered today." "Matt says New York reminds him of the lady," Mary interposed. "Few noticed when she died, but the difference to her." I said nothing. Matt tipped the barrel over for Skinny to roll away. Matt began to head another barrel. It took an earthquake, he announced, to show you sophisticated people what we dubs knew. This country is so damn big that one New York more or less makes no difference. Down on the railroad track, a train whistled for the crossing. Out on the highway, a milk truck rattled past. I picked up the morning paper which Mary had glanced through. The headline caught my eye. Relief organized. No panic is feared. I did not stop to argue the point with Matt. The evidence was all on his side. I took Mary Hull's arm and led her back into the cool shadows of the packing house, where tiers of barrels concealed us from observation. I kissed her. It was our betrothal kiss, postponed for 2 days. Matt is wrong about the relative importance of things, Mary whispered. This is all that matters. Let's go back and tell him so. Aww. Y'all, that's the end. And the next story is called Bride of the Ape. Happy ending, right? Millions die. Doesn't matter. They're not important. I happen to know that, yeah. As it turns out, when there's a disaster in New York, it matters. We have learned this over the course of 100 years. That's when the story was written. I feel like this story was written about 100 years ago. Also, I'm really curious about a story called Bride of the Ape. Anybody else feel that? It was dark, abysmally dark. There was not even a star in the heavens to relieve the fathomless blackness that surrounded us on all sides. That's for next time. I kind of feel like Bride of the Ape is going to be a bit more exciting than this particular one was. So, but that's for next time. That's for next time. And now I'm going to go make food. It's my time to make dinner. And I am not going to raid tonight. I will see you all, Sunday night is our podcast, 6:30 p.m. Central. So I'll be doing that, and then we'll be back to painting again on Tuesday at 3 p.m. Central, which is my Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday stream. I will see you next time. Have a good night, everybody. Oh, Pyro Club is on tonight, so we'll be watching D&D. I hope. I hope. Should be on. Must see Friday TV. All right. Have a good weekend, everybody. Thanks for hanging out while I read this awful Pulp Fiction story from the early 1900s. Bye.